has happened.
Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers and with me today are Spike's deputy editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spike columnist Ella Whelan.
Hi.
Coming up on the show, the Australian elections, milkshaking and Mayor Pete versus Thomas Jefferson.
How good is Australia?
We report from Canberra on the most unlikely and unexpected general election victory in modern Australian history.
Years of polling from a number of different outlets predicted that Bill Shorten and the Labor Party would be successful on Saturday.
These are the quiet Australians who have won a great victory tonight.
Last weekend, the National Liberal Coalition won a surprise victory in the Australian elections. This was supposed to be an unlosable election for the opposition Labour Party. All of the polls pointed to a Labour victory. One polling organisation, Newspoll, predicted a defeat for the coalition in 56 successive polls. Tom, can you tell us a bit about this shock election win?
Well, it was definitely a shock. And the reason it was a shock, Fraser, as you point to, was just the fact that received opinion, all of the polling had been pointing towards a Labour victory, not just in the kind of campaign, but for years. You know, as you say, there were these 56 consecutive polls which suggested Labour victory. An exit poll, which was seen as broadly infallible in these situations, suggested that Labour were going to win with 82 seats. In the end, they got 69 to the ruling coalition's 76. So this was obviously a huge chasm between what the opinion forming set and what the pollsters thought was going to happen and what the kind of mood was on the ground. I think it's really interesting as well to see where the coalition won. So Scott Morrison presenting himself very much as a kind of everyman, as a kind of common sense conservative, whilst Labour very much trying to make this an election about climate change, about radicalism on that issue, as well as certain redistributive policies. But it certainly became a bit of a referendum on that particular issue. One of the big flashpoints being a very controversial mining project in Queensland. And the coalition did very well in Queensland. They did very well in suburban, often blue-collar areas. Meanwhile, you saw Labour picking up support, but not enough support in former kind of liberal coalition strongholds in wealthier parts of the cities. As I say, it didn't really reach high enough in order for them to capture any of those seats. The one significant exception being former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, who lost his quite wealthy Sydney seat to a kind of independent environmentalist. But what we're kind of seeing is really this kind of realignment of politics whereby particularly blue collar workers, who David Goodhart might call the somewheres, moving more and more towards parties of the centre right, or at least those kind of tribal loyalties to the old parties of the left starting to weaken. It's been talked about in the same breath as Brexit and Trump. I think it's a little bit of a tricky comparison insofar as we are talking about a ruling party being returned to power, and they are just a centre-right party. But nevertheless, I think on a lot of those issues, the support for Morrison did reflect the gap between the opinion forming set and the people, and as well as this kind of cultural gap, I think, between who he called the quiet Australians and the kind of media elite who were all expecting, and you got the sense, hoping for a Labour victory. So it might not necessarily be a populist upset on the level of other things that we've seen recently. It expresses all of those trends, it seems like.
Ella, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting that people have been talking about Morrison's Pentecostalist faith, and the fact that he said that miracles can happen. This is a miracle in relation to the election result. I mean, I think if you're fairly switched on in today's current, global political climate, it probably could have seen this coming, because the fact is there's a trend that if you go in really hard on the kind of green policies that the Labour Party did, and say that you're going to absolutely slash carbon emissions and that this is a climate emergency, and basically make out that anyone who doesn't agree with you is some kind of planet-hating, fascist, then people are not gonna vote for you. The majority of, as Nick Cater wrote in Spiked, blue-collar workers are not going to vote for you because it's a kind of demonisation of a certain section of society. So I think it was less a miracle and more actually just a kind of, assertion of the state of politics, which is that actually nothing hugely exciting really has happened other than a rejection of the kind of very metropolitan elite stance of the Labour Party. But something needs to come forward now and not just allow the same status quo parties to clear up and to clean up, but something new to come and take advantage of that desire for a better kind of bigger politics.
I'm absolutely fascinated by the divide on climate change. Bill Shorten, the opposition Labour leader, wanted to set an emissions target, 3 times more stringent than the Paris Agreement.
Yeah.
And this is in Australia, the country that extracts a third of the world's coal. And it seems as if, the people who are now voting for the Labour Party, the liberal intelligentsia, the people who live in the cities, are obviously would not be affected so much by the job losses that would entail. But obviously, the people on the ground, the people in places like Queensland, where the Liberal Party made huge gains
Swept
against
the board,
against
of seats to
expectations.
Labour there.
And then, obviously, inevitably, you get the reaction to the results, where people say that now, because of this one election, the entire planet is doomed, and the Great Barrier Reef is going to be destroyed.
And I think in the context of, governments like the British government declaring a climate emergency, Extinction Rebellion, the continuing rising fame of Greta Thunberg and everything else, it does just show that there is this huge disconnect on the issue of climate. And you saw this so perfectly summed up in the Australian election, and particularly in Queensland, where the election really was won, around this issue of that coal mine that was being built. Because again, working people see something that's going to create thousands of jobs, and what all the kind of liberal intelligentsia can see is something that's going to create, units of CO2 emissions. There's this huge disjoint on that issue, and you can't get away from the fact that at the moment it does feel like liberals in metropolitan areas just have the luxury of caring about climate change, whilst other people are more concerned, understandably and rightly so, with more bread and butter issues. And I think the other thing that's worth talking about on the question of the Australian election is also the polling, which is really, really fascinating, because this is something we have seen time and time again with various kind of elections going a different way. And we almost think that this is something that was just about Brexit and Trump. But of course, in 2015 in Britain, when David Cameron's Conservative Party won this unexpected majority, there was a lot of discussion about that, even back then. And it does seem that you do have, in the same way that a lot of the people in the media and political classes are cut off, that infects the world of polling as well, potentially because people feel, because of the general discourse, that people feel nervous about saying who they're actually going to vote for to pollsters is one explanation. There's, of course, a more sort of fundamental point is, of course, when you see polls, this isn't just a case of them talking to a broadly representative sample and then just presenting the results. They will make all kinds of adjustments. Often based on what other polls are doing. So again, you have people's kind of, confirmation bias reaffirming everyone else's, which is really interesting. But I think what's in the context of Australia, it's particularly striking the role that polls have increasingly played in politics as politicians and the media have become more distant from ordinary people, don't really have their finger on the pulse. As many people will know, there's been this kind of revolving door prime ministerial office in Australia for a long time. Over the past 6 years, they've had 3 prime ministers, Tony Abbott, then Malcolm Turnbull, who ousted him, then Scott Morrison, who ousted Malcolm Turnbull with the help of Tony Abbott in this kind of quite sort of courtly fashion. And a lot of the reason that Abbott and then Turnbull were ousted was on the basis of polling. Polling, which it turns out might not have been as significant. So you'd really do start to see not only polling in the way it reaffirms some people's in the media spheres kind of biases and wish fulfillment as an expression of that kind of gap, but also the kind of way in which polling, as politics becomes a lot more detached from ordinary people, it starts to kind of take on an influence of its own, which is kind of interesting. And I think that this other shock result kind of really hammers that home, it feels like.
I think it's interesting because they seem to take to measure the temperature of the public, not only from polling, but also from international circles. So there is this tendency, Nick Cater wrote about this in Spiked, that Bill Shorten comes across as if he's a bit embarrassed about Australia, that Australia is an embarrassment in the eyes of the world because of its views on climate, because of its stance on immigration, or for various things. But and we saw the same in Brexit Britain. The Remainers are constantly talking about how embarrassing it is to be British, and Trump's America is an embarrassment in the eyes of the world. But actually, if you talk to ordinary people in other countries, they're not. I think people in Britain probably have quite a good view of Australia, whether they know its politics or not. And if you talk to someone in France, an ordinary person in France, they don't think Brexit is embarrassing. They probably like a bit of it for themselves. So it's interesting the way that the kind of new elites are talking to each other in their own in quite internationalized circles, and despairing at the state of their respective countries, and almost thinking of that as the same as public opinion.
Yeah, well, I mean, shock polling is often the sign of, it's a simple point to make, but it's the sign of a pretty unhealthy political climate, because it means that people are sort of too embarrassed to come out with the truth of what they're actually thinking and what they're actually believing in. But it's completely understandable, because the narrative, certainly around the climate change debate, is explicit that if you don't get on board with the kind of quite extreme policies that some of the environmentalist groups are putting forward, or like the Labour Party's in Australia's plans to kind of cut emissions, then you are simply a kind of a Neanderthal who wants the planet to end. I mean, it's just as explicit as that. And it's crazy that that's the kind of narrative that gets put forward, especially when you take into consideration, that embarrassing moment when Bill Shorten suggested that it only took 8 to 10 minutes to charge an electric car, and actually it took hours. So it's not like these people are the experts that they claim to be, and yet there's such a kind of elitist attitude to this that it's no wonder people are hiding what they really think. So if you'd hope that what this election does is kind of give a wake-up call to the powers that be that say your current approach to talking down to people and to demonising certain points of view is only going to end in your downfall, and so we have to make a much more open approach to political discourse.
You're listening to the Spike Podcast. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. During the EU elections, a number of controversial candidates have had milkshakes thrown over them. The first major figure to be milkshaked was EDL founder Tommy Robinson. YouTuber turned UKIPper Carl Benjamin, aka Sargon of Akkad, has been hit with milkshake at least 4 times during campaigning. And this week, Brexit Party leader Nigel Farage was pelted with milkshake on the campaign trail in Newcastle. Ella, what do you make of this milkshaking trend?
I think it really speaks to the fact that there is a bit of a debasement of political discourse at the moment, and some people might roll their eyes and say, "Oh, you just sound like a kind of fuddy-duddy who, thinks that political protest or expressions of political disdain should be clamped down on." And there's nothing big or clever about throwing milkshakes at people. And one of the things that Brendan O'Neill wrote on Spiked this week was the wild hypocrisy of the fact that you just imagine what would have happened if, let's say, Emily Thornberry, Anna Soubry, or really anyone in the Remain camp had been milkshaked. There would be absolute uproar, and there would be criminal action taken against the person, and there certainly wouldn't be high street chains like Burger King advertising on Twitter where people who want to go and milkshake politicians can get their supplies from. There's been a kind of cavalier approach to actually the seriousness of what it means to, assault someone who's on the campaign trail in the process of democracy. And while throwing a milkshake at someone isn't really the end of the world, and it's probably a bit far to class it as assault, it certainly is trying to shut down democratic debate.
Yeah, definitely. And I agree that, it's not violence in any meaningful sense. It is nevertheless incredibly strange to see the way that it's been celebrated among the commentariat. I mean, Aditya Chakraborty at The Guardian even called it the milkshake spring. And, the Independent's Tom Peck has been going around saying it's not funny, it's hilarious. And, I can see why you might muster a giggle at it, but it's really not that funny. And there is a kind of it has sort of been legitimised as a sort of tactic for shutting people up, I guess.
Exactly. I mean, we're recording this on the morning of the European Union elections, and we just got a press release through which is talking about someone set up a milkshake stand at Nigel Farage's polling station. Some sort of plant-powered drinks company has sent this up as a bit of a stunt. So it has very quickly become a bit of a joke. And it is interesting, as Ella was saying, not just the difference between what happened to Nigel Farage with a hypothetical milkshaking of Anna Soubry, but what happened when Anna Soubry was called a Nazi by those kind of idiotic, wannabe yellow vest protesters outside of Parliament. There was national outcry that lasted days and days and days, and it was all centred around a politician who a lot of people in the mainstream media happen to agree with on the issue of Brexit being called a name. So there is this ridiculous double standards. I think we do need to be a little bit careful, particularly from certain Leave voters. There's been this tendency to talk about what happened to Nigel Farage as straightforward political violence, which I think is over-egging it, to say the least. And also we should recognise that this isn't necessarily something that new. I mean, one of my favourite clips in political recent history was John Prescott walking down towards an event, being egged by someone at close range and then punching him in the face. So it was, in retaliation. So it's not as if this has never really happened. I completely agree with the point that this is, an attack on certain people's political positions. It is incredibly infantile. I don't think we should encourage it. I think there's also a persuasive argument in that, unlike many countries, particularly the US, our political leaders are very accessible. And that's one of the best things about it. You can more or less, if you happen to see him on the street, roll up on Jeremy Corbyn and start having a conversation with him. There's not going to be, he's not going to be surrounded by Secret Service and people with earpieces in, keeping a perimeter at all times. That's actually quite a good thing. Yeah. And I think the more that this sort of thing happens, the more that's going to be something which is going to become less and less possible to do. But at the same time, I think what was most striking about it, as Ella's already said and as Brendan wrote about, were those double standards, because, we would be having a conversation about how these milkshakes were demonstrating that we were being marched back into the dark days of political violence if it wasn't for the fact that it happened to Nigel Farage rather than someone who a lot of these commentators happen to like.
Yeah, and I think worst of all, even worse than the double standards have been the ridiculous logical contortions that have been used to justify it. So it's very strange to hear people say it's okay because these candidates, whether it's Tommy Robinson, Carl Benjamin or Nigel Farage, incite violence. And of course, you look at their statements, they've never done such a thing as to incite violence. Incitement to violence is a very serious thing where you basically order someone pretty much to carry out an attack. Or even worse, people say it's okay because they spread hate speech. And, again, it's not the most serious and threatening or, violent action in the world. But, on some level, people must be able to understand that speech is not as serious as any kind of action, and the confusion of those two things is really, really troubling.
And people were just quoting in some of these instances when they were basically trying to dismiss the milkshake thing and say, what's worse, Nigel Farage inciting all of this anger and hatred and violence, were things like him basically using kind of military metaphors to talk about the Brexit victory. It was incredibly, incredibly thin.
Yeah, one of the things that's been particularly gross in reaction to it has been the kind of cross-party hand-wringing among certain politicians who, have come across the political divide to say that, this is totally wrong. This is, the incitement to violence on politicians is wrong. That even if, from their point of view, someone like Farage is exactly the same as a fascist or a Nazi, that you still don't do these kind of things. And the thing that just makes me, shiver about that is it's absolutely nothing to do with a desire for better public debate or for, a championing of healthy, rigorous political discourse. It's because these politicians are... It's because our politicians today are so hostile to the idea of public engagement that actually it's the best thing that could ever happen to them, a couple of milkshakes being thrown at politicians, because then they get to point at the public and say, see, this is how terrible and volatile you are, this is how dangerous you are. And so we have to bring in the kind of legislation that we were talking about on the podcast last week, protections for politicians during election campaigns, which will inevitably spread into a kind of insulation of our elected representatives from the public. So I think the best approach going forward is to say, you're not going to die if you get milkshaked. It's not the end of the world, and politicians should be held accountable. But let's not suddenly now start saying that just because a few idiots threw a few milkshakes, we now have a populace that's a danger to politics as it currently stands.
You're listening to the Spiked podcast. Spiked has no subscriptions and no paywalls. All of our content is free. We rely on the generosity of our listeners and readers to keep us going and growing. For those of you who already donate to Spiked, we can't thank you enough. It really means a lot to the team. If you haven't already, then why not consider giving Spiked a donation? You can make a one-off payment or give monthly by going to spiked-online.com. 2020 presidential hopeful Pete Buttigieg has called for events named after founding father Thomas Jefferson to be renamed. The Democratic Party hosts an annual fundraising event called Jefferson-Jackson Dinners. But for Mayor Pete, Jefferson's legacy of slavery is problematic. Jefferson is believed to have owned 600 slaves in his lifetime. Tom, do you want to tell us a bit about this semi-scandal?
I think semi is probably the right word. It was a story that was kind of leapt upon quite quickly by the right-wing media in America. But nevertheless, Mayor Pete was talking about this issue of specifically these Democratic fundraising dinners. There have been some places in America where the Democrats had decided to rename them, and he was responding to that and saying that was probably a good thing because of the Democrats' focus as he saw it on racial equality, etc., etc. But this quickly got turned into Mayor Pete wants to, blow up the Jefferson Memorial, that he wants to rename every street that is named after Jefferson, every high school, which was obviously not the case. But nevertheless, it is significant because he is tapping into this broader trend of places in America wanting to rename buildings, rename programs, in some cases remove statues of particular historical figures, and also particularly Jefferson. So in 2015, at the University of Missouri, as well as the College of William and Mary, there were statues of Jefferson which were protested against, plastered in post-it notes labelling him racist and rapist, referring to his relationship with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings, who he's believed to have fathered 5 children with. And it really tapping into this idea of needing to kind of remove these old symbols in order to reckon with America's kind of racist past. And I think even though he was suggesting a kind of softer version of that, it still expresses some of those tendencies. And this tendency really to appraise all American historical figures, even the founding fathers, the people who are the intellectual basis for the Republic and had a huge impact on world history as well, purely on the slavery question and purely on the race question, and to basically only ever look at history through that lens and feel completely unable, therefore, to celebrate these people for their contributions outside of that. Of course, Thomas Jefferson is a key example of that core contradiction of the American Republic. He drafts the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal and yet own slaves. But nevertheless, I think that this tendency to want to only really look at historical figures through this one lens is, on the one hand, incredibly reductive, but also just feeds a kind of cultural battle, which I don't think is necessary for anyone to try and fight. And even though Mayor Pete was not necessarily going as far down this rabbit hole as some people in the media were trying to make out, he was necessarily giving a little bit of credence to that particular point of view.
Yeah, I found one of his phrasings really interesting, and you'll hear this a lot among the people who are making the argument for tearing down statues. He said that he doesn't want to blot Jefferson out of the history books or delete him from being one of the founding fathers, but it's about who you choose to honour. Now, of course, this is the argument that's often made by the people arguing for decolonisation, Rhodes must fall. It's said that the statue is honouring this person for something dubious, but it's pretty obvious in the case of Jefferson that he is not being honoured for holding slaves. It is not the evil thing that he is being honoured for. I mean, that becomes more complex in cases like Robert E. Lee, where he is being honoured for something a bit more dubious.
Yeah.
But again, it seems to me a very sort of sly attempt to, if not erase them from history, but then erase them from the present, and to keep these kind of uncomfortable aspects of the past out of sight and out of mind, as if that really would solve issues in the present.
I mean, honouring someone is open to question, isn't it? Because there's really nothing, in a different context, there's nothing wrong with changing the name of your celebrity dinner, change it to whatever you like. It's not really about that. It's the reasoning behind why they want to change the names. And Mayor Pete was explicit in saying that it's not about, like, as you said, Fraser, it's not about wiping out history, but he says it's because racism is alive, it's well, it's hurting people, and it's one of the main reasons to be in politics today is to change or reverse the harms that went along with that. So he's being very explicit there in saying that the existence going forward of things like dinners with the names of Jefferson and Jackson in them, what that does is kind of compounds the racism today and reaffirms the idea that black people are different to white people. I mean, anyone who is aware of kind of the level of racism in America knows that it is not true. It is not the same as the days of slavery. And actually in the fight going forward against racism, to, as we've said a lot of the time on Spiked, to suggest that statues and the names of dinners or the names of buildings or whatever it is as harmful and hurtful in a racist sense as real lived racism and real discrimination is a kind of an insult to both to black people, but also it hurts the anti-racist project because you're not really taking racism seriously. If a dinner name or a building can be racist, well, then it sort of diminishes the seriousness of racism. So we always have to look at the context of why these things are happening. It's not just because we want to be a bit nicer, and it's not just because, Jefferson is a bit old hat. It's because there's this underlying idea that you have to block and shield and protect certain sections of society, minorities, from certain things because they are so fragile. That is a very problematic idea. And you might even go as far as to argue that actually that's quite a discriminatory idea.
I thought what was also interesting was what he suggested these dinners should be renamed. Actually, there was a little clip of someone from TMZ. They asked him a couple of questions and he raised this point that's in some places they'd renamed them the Kennedy-Obama dinners. Yeah. And you think the idea of putting Barack Obama on some sort of level pegging with Thomas Jefferson, when you reduce historical figures to just what feels to be the most politically salient question of the day, what was their view on that question, you miss the depth of their contribution historically, politically in general. And there was a similar case in Britain a couple of years ago at the University of Liverpool, where one of the student halls was named after Gladstone. And so a bunch of students got together and said that they wanted it to be renamed because Gladstone had benefited from slavery. And the person they suggested in place was Channel 4's Jon Snow. And you kind of get to the question of, now, of course, on the question of race, Jon Snow might pass in a way that Gladstone doesn't. But nevertheless, the idea that these two people are on a par for who should be honoured is absolutely ludicrous. And I think the thing that this whole discussion gestures to in more broadly, which is the discussion about statues and buildings on campus and elsewhere, is that there's a slightly worrying tendency to not just dismiss morally people like Thomas Jefferson, but also to kind of dismiss the ideas that he articulated along with it. You know, a lot of these people saying that that core contradiction, as we were talking about in the founding of America, really speaks to the fact that these ideas of freedom, etc., are always nonsense to begin with. They were just high-minded principles used to cover privilege. And I think that's a really, really dangerous thing as well. And the thing about something like the Declaration of Independence was that the ideas that it articulated in there about all men being created equal, about having these unalienable rights of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, those ideals were what inspired people further down the line to actually make sure that America lived up to those ideals. You know, Martin Luther King in the I Have a Dream speech quoted that line in particular and said that they were here today to cash that check. So I think it's really important that, and one of the most concerning things about this whole discussion is that in the process of, junking these historical figures, there is a tendency to junk the ideas that they set out as well, which even if they didn't live up to, were really important for politics and progress later on down the line.
Thank you for listening to the Spike podcast. We'll be back next week. And for more great Spike content, just visit spikes-